Welcome. I'm Nicole Serby, and I'm joined here today by my colleague Michael Puglisi to talk about our latest monthly economic outlook. So Mike, can you talk us through what we've seen since our latest economic update?
Yeah, so I think the biggest story since our last update a month ago has just been the continued weakening in the US labor market. We've seen this in some of the key employment data from BLS, like non-farm payrolls, where the 3-month moving average has fallen all the way to just 29,000 new jobs per month. This has been corroborated by some private sector data sources like ADP, which have shown sort of a similar deceleration in the private sector employment data. But it extends beyond just the growth in non-farm payrolls and employment more generally. The unemployment rate hit a high of 4.3% last month. We've seen worker sentiment about job availability continue to sour. The job openings per unemployed persons dip below 1 for the first time since 2021. And so the balance of the data have really been towards a labor market that appears to be kind of at stall speed right now. And then on the inflation side, say a little bit less interesting in terms of new developments, just continued signs that inflation is stuck around 3%, with somewhat higher goods prices, largely from the tariffs that we saw go into effect earlier this year, kind of leading the way on those higher prices, but offset in part by tamer service sector inflation over throughout the kind of most parts of this year. And so you pull that all together, and we're at an inflation backdrop that's not anywhere near as high as it was, say, 2 or 3 years ago when consumer price inflation was up near 6, 7, 8, 9%, but still about a percentage point above the Fed's target at the moment.
Right. So what you said there is keen, because what we've seen is the unemployment rate is headed higher. So now we see some risks around the maximum employment side of the mandate. And we also see that inflation is persistent, also above the price stability mandate. So what is the Fed to do in reaction to a situation like this?
Yeah, so this is a real challenge, right? With inflation that's above target, possibly trending in the wrong direction, at the same time as there's threats to the Fed's full employment mandates. And I think in this specific situation, the Fed is going to put a little more weight on the employment side of its mandate. And I think that for a few reasons. One is monetary policy is pretty clearly restrictive right now. Knowing where neutral on the policy rate is difficult to say, but I think most analysts, including us, think it's somewhere between 3 and 3.5% on Fed funds. And today it's in the mid-4s. So cutting rates by 100 or 150 basis points would not necessarily make monetary policy accommodative, but just move it closer to neutral. I think a second reason, like we just talked about a moment ago, is the labor market is in a very precarious position. And once it starts to go, once you see negative payroll growth or unemployment that rises a little more sharply, that can get a bit nonlinear, which is, of course, something the Fed very much wants to avoid. And then finally, when it comes to the inflation backdrop, while we'd like to see inflation moving lower over the course of this year, it's our belief that the inflation that's been induced by tariffs should be transitory as long as inflation expectations remain well anchored, which they seem to have been so far. So that we slowly but surely start to see slower inflation over 2026 as those tariff impacts fall out, even though the peak is probably still 3 to 6 months away. And so you pull all those factors together, and it's our expectation that the Fed will cut 3 more times this year. So 25 basis points in September, 25 in October, 25 in December, with 2 more 25 basis point rate cuts in the first half of next year at the March and June meetings, and then a long hold from there. And that would put the Fed funds rate, again, kind of in the low 3s, right around what we consider to be roughly neutral, to try to promote full employment and hopefully keep inflation moving in the right direction, if not in the near term, over the course of 2026. Now, when you think about that backdrop, Nicole, how are you feeling about recession risks for the U.S. economy? Given the kind of weaker backdrop for growth through the first half of the year, given the slowdown in the labor market, what do you think the odds are of a recession, say, over the next 12 months?
We have dialed up our recession probability forecast. Right now, I think, as you said, the labor market is showing some clear signs of weakening. We're hitting stall speed, and as you said, it can turn quick if it does turn. And so in light of that, we've bumped up our recession probability. We're around 35% chance of a recession occurring in the United States in the next 12 months. But what I'll say there is it seems like these next 6 months are the most tenuous stretch that we have. We have tariffs continuing to take a bite out of economic activity. Price pressures around tariffs are still continuing to mount for many firms across the economy. And then we also have, as you said, monetary policy today is pretty restrictive. So even as the Fed is starting to lower interest rates in these coming months, that lagged effect likely will not be felt until 2026. Coming into 2026, we're more optimistic about economic growth. You have looser monetary policy continuing to filter its way through. And then you also have the household sector that's likely going to benefit from looser tax policy. We have the new provisions from the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. So when households are filing their taxes in the spring, they'll likely see a lift in discretionary income growth just as those lower tax rates actually take form. And so that's our outlook for 2026. We are pretty optimistic on growth there. And Mike, turning back to you, we have in this update published our initial forecast for 2027. What are our expectations there?
Yeah, well, when thinking about the 2027 outlook, that's obviously the most hazy, right? As we think about the visibility we have over the remainder of this year and 2026, I think a theme is more clear in my mind when it comes to the slowdown we're seeing this year from higher tariffs, more restrictive monetary policy, so some cutbacks in the government sector, but the potential for an acceleration over the course of 2026 as those tariff impacts hopefully fade and as the fiscal and monetary policy stimulus comes online throughout next year. For 2027, I think of it more as a kind of steady state or equilibrium forecast, trying to give a sense of what does normal look like in the world right now in the 2020s. And for us, that's economic growth that's maybe a little bit above 2%, inflation that is at or a little bit above 2%, Fed funds, once again, kind of in that low 3 ranges, a 10-year Treasury yield that is a little bit above 4%, a budget deficit in the $2 trillion range, 6.5% of GDP. I think that's kind of the steady state equilibrium normal for the economy. But of course, as we get a lot closer to 2027, other factors and new developments are going to shape that outlook. And so even though this is just our initial rollout, we'll continue to fine tune it as we learn more about the factors that are going to shape the economy, not just in the near term in 25 and 26, but also over the longer run.
Plenty ahead. Well, thank you, Mike, and thank you, everyone, for tuning in to our latest monthly economic outlook.